Okay, I think we're going to start now. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Connectivity Advisory Panel kickoff session. Appreciate everyone taking the time to meet. I know that everyone here has a day job and we're actually meeting in the middle of the day, so really appreciate that. I am John Paralisi. I am the Spark project director who was brought on board in December to help structure this process and to lead it through to the end. One thing I want to note up front is, my role. My role really is purely a process role. So for any of these advisory panels, I am not the content expert. You all were chosen because you're content experts and you have unique perspectives and expertise to bring to bear for this process under the leadership of the chairs. So with that, could you go to the next slide, please? So, in terms of going through, what we're going to be, how we're going to walk through this today, there are basically kind of 5 pieces of the discussion. So I'm going to kick off with an overview and I know everyone was on an orientation session last week, but really to kind of revisit, here's the purpose of the panel, do some introductions, talk a little bit about rules of engagement. I'm also going to go through a little bit around some of the funding to date and the landscape, and talk a little bit around kind of where we start and focus. Then Stanley is going to be spending more time doing an overview of the state's broadband strategy, as well as how to think about that in terms of the funding landscape. And then I'll end up with talking about kind of where we're going to go next. One thing I'd say is at the start of this, it's going to be much more kind of presentation mode, but pretty quickly, certainly by the end, it's going to be much more collaborative and it's meant to really be a discussion. But if anyone has a question along the way, feel free to kind of raise your hand and, we can talk about whatever questions people might have. Go to the next slide, please. So, from the orientation sessions, you would have seen this kind of funnel slide that we created in order to just kind of visually illustrate the process that each one of the advisory panels is meant to go through. And the goals around this is to just really understand at the front end, what are the critical needs in connectivity and surface opportunities for impact. The good thing here is that a tremendous amount of work has been done over the last months around connectivity and thinking about what the opportunities are and the strategic priorities in Kansas. So we're definitely going to take that into account, but at the same time, we still have, the submissions form out there. And we are going to be getting, hopefully, submissions from across Kansas. We're going to probably, though, think about those submissions in the context of some of the focus areas that have been teed up in the work on the broadband strategy, although we could look outside of that as well. And once again, all of these numbers in this funnel are really just meant to be illustrative. Those aren't targets for how many ideas at any stage in the process. But the advisory panel itself is then going to be able to work through the process in terms of, filtering out things that may not really fit. And then on the ideas that fit, really prioritizing those ideas and working through ultimately what kind of portfolio, of a recommendation of ideas to focus on and funding requests that they want to put forward to the Spark committee. So speaking of the Spark committee, the Spark committee, months ago, as part of this process, as we're starting out, put forward guiding principles around how they think about Spark and the investment of the ARPA funds. And so, this whole process was really structured to try and deliver against these guiding principles. And as the Spark Committee is evaluating proposals from the advisory panels, I'm pretty sure these will be top of mind for all the members of the Spark Committee. So once again, it's really around prioritizing sustainable programs and investments through one-time use of funds versus substantial expansion of existing services. So that may take a little bit of creativity in some cases to really make sure that they're catalytic one-time investments. But at the same time, making sure that, all of these opportunities live within a broader funding landscape. So really thinking about wherever we can, leveraging local agency funds, other sources of funds, to make sure that we're able to leverage these ARPA funds where there's some discretion around as much as possible. Always have the lens of fostering long-term impact for Kansans, while also considering equitable opportunities and outcomes. The last two are really around, kind of how we think about implementation of this in terms of enabling the correct level of flexibility within some of these investment strategies. So while some may look like a specific project, in more cases, it may look like programs, and we may have ideas on specific projects that would fit into those programs, but there'll be some flexibility around coming out of this, where to apply the funds. And then ensuring that whatever we do is measurable, we can track, transparency and accountability against that. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Senator Peterson to, begin introducing the panel to each other and giving everyone a chance to introduce themselves.
Thank you, John. Hey, I'm Mike Peterson. I'm Senate Transportation Chair. I've also served on the task force committee we had a couple years ago looking at broadband back when speeds were a lot slower. What I'd like to do is I'd like to go through and get people just to give a little bit of their skill sets. While we may not be choosing specific projects in this task force here, but we are wanting to come up with good ideas and get things moving forward. I'd like for Stanley Adams, could you give us just a little bit of your skill sets and where you come from? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Stanley Adams. I'm the director of the Office of Broadband Development, which is in the Department of Commerce, and been working on advancing broadband for a number of years. And obviously, this is we're at a momentous time in trying to make a big impact for our state.
Senator Hawk.
Unmuted. Yes, I've been in the legislature, I think 16 years in the House and the Senate. I've been on Utilities Committee and have been very interested in telecom issues. I worked in my school district many years ago, trying to get a fiber broadband set up, probably before most school districts did that. So have seen the benefit to it for public education, and certainly want to see us put a substantial amount of money in it from the Spark perspective and the legislative perspective, because I think it is a critical part of our economic future. Great to be part of this committee.
Representative Smith.
Good morning. My name is Representative Adam Smith. I am a farmer and rancher out in Northwest Kansas. I've been in the legislature for 6 years. Currently serving as chairman of taxation. I also chaired the committee for rural revitalization we had for a couple of years back in the House. We worked on some broadband issues, heard a lot about the different problems that exist, mostly in rural Kansas, and getting broadband access out there. But happy to be a part of the group, happy to offer my perspective. And I'm sorry I don't have video. My internet, ironically, does not support enough bandwidth to have video, so I'll be joining audio, but glad to be a part of the group.
Thank you, Adam. Daniel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Daniel Friesen. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer and co-founder at Idea Tech. We're a fiber broadband provider in the state, focused mainly in rural areas, built few thousand miles of fiber all over the state, and was previously a member of the Kansas Broadband Task Force, and I'm a part-time government official as well. I previously served as mayor of the city of Buhler, now county commissioner for Reno County. So excited to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yes, Jeff Wick, and I'm the general manager of WTC based in Wamego, Kansas. And we have a long history of building broadband in remote rural areas of Kansas. And we've done that with our own funding, as well as we have been involved in grant programs in the past. So experience working in that umbrella, and excited to be on the committee and panel going forward. Thanks.
Dr. Anderson? Dr. Anderson, are you on? We'll move over to Ed Taylor. How about Brian Volgamore?
Yep, I'm here. I'm a farmer from out in western Kansas. We, with my brother, we farm across 8 different counties. We've utilized precision ag and broadband and all sorts of technology to scale our farm. And so I don't know what my specific skill sets are, knowing a lot about connectivity, but I sure know how to use it if we have it. So anyways, that's who I am.
Will you be able to share some of the needs of the precision ag community? That's for sure an important part. Paul, are you on?
I am. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Paul Truitt, so Vice President of Field Operations for Cox Communications. So we serve quite a few areas in the state of Kansas, as well as through the Midwest and the United States. So been doing this for probably 35 plus years. And so I'm looking forward to really helping solve this digital divide. Thanks.
Thank you. Molly, did you make it on?
I did. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Molly Coker-Boyle. I'm a president for AT&T. We've been doing business in the state for more than 140 years with more than 1 million fiber strand miles. I was proud to sit on the state's broadband task force with several others of this panel, and looking forward to participating and helping share whatever we can to help inform this opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate you serving. Does any of the support staff wish to introduce themselves?
I'd introduce sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'll introduce myself briefly. Ethan Belshie, Director of Public Affairs for the Office of Recovery. I think I've emailed with many of you as we've been working towards getting these panels set up. So nice to put some faces and names, and looking forward to supporting the panel process.
Appreciate that. There we go.
Also, Mr. Chair, Alicia Johnson-Turner, I serve as Deputy Executive Director at the Office of Recovery. So excited to get things off and moving. So thank you for everybody for being here today.
Thank you. We'll see no one else to introduce themselves. I guess I'll turn this back over to John to go over our timeline.
Sure, great. Next slide, please. One point I will make, though, in terms of support is that there is an awful lot of support that's going to be coming into this process to support the panel and the panelists from a variety of organizations. And so our goal in supporting this is, since we realize that it's a very fast-paced and extremely important process, to make sure that we kind of free the members here in order to be able to kind of move at the pace that that they need to in order to do this. And we also realize that not everyone is going to be able to make every single one of the sessions, and our commitment is going to be, all of these will be recorded, but also to be able to work with anyone who can't make it to a meeting, to work with them to just make sure that they don't lose a beat in the cadence here, which gets us to the overall timeline. And I've gone through this before in the orientation session, so I'm not going to go through it in too much detail here. But basically, the approach is there are 4 panels. We've already had the orientation sessions. This is the first kickoff. Each one of the panels is generally going to flow through a situation assessment, understanding and identifying maybe the most important needs to target, idea generation around things we could do in order to be able to solve those needs and priorities, filtering and scoring ideas that come in either from the public or from government, or maybe even more so from this group itself, to make sure that we understand what the highest priority opportunities are. And then taking that and putting together kind of a portfolio recommendation to go to the Spark Committee. The goal for that is for that to happen largely in the February-March timeframe. And then for the panel chairs, in early April to start being able to talk directly with the Spark Committee itself around those recommendations. And there'll probably be some kind of back and forth iteration, answering questions that the Spark Committee might have, following up on requests. And then at the Spark Committee level, working through all the recommendations that have come from all the panels, which will represent more funding requests than can be funded. But the goal then is to be able to make those trade-offs and understand what an integrated funding proposal would be to go to the State Finance Council, hopefully in early May. So a lot of moving pieces on this. Aggressive timeline. Once again, appreciate everyone's involvement and commitment to this. Next slide. So each one of the panels, even though that's generally the intent in terms of the flow, are starting off in a little bit different places. And so for connectivity, we anticipate 4 meetings to reach a final recommendation, though we would say that, this is the first time that we're doing this in this format. And so the only thing I know for sure around this approach is that we're going to need to tweak this approach as we go forward. And so we will adapt as we need to go forward on this. But in the kickoff session, the big things that we really want to achieve were those introductions that we just did, to level set people on the process, but also to review and discuss the existing broadband strategy, because so much work has been done against that over the last several months. To the extent possible, we really should try and stand on the shoulders of all that work rather than trying to start from scratch, as well as understand existing needs and potential funding pipelines. So thinking about all of the potential priorities in the context of all the sources of funding that are out there, because there definitely will be, given the nature of it, a sweet spot for these funds. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, and I've already touched on it a little bit, here are some considerations around the pressure points that we're probably going to need to navigate, and just to be kind of clear up front around that. So general key considerations for the Spark process are that, once again, learning curve to set up and run new process at an accelerated rate. So to the extent this is new, there are going to be things we weren't able to anticipate. We're just going to need to be flexible, adaptable. And the one thing I'd ask from everyone is, we all going to need to have a little bit of grace around making shifts along the way. Even the new submission process to solicit ideas is probably a little bit new. So, I'm sure that is going to be something that we're going to need to take into account as we move forward. I mentioned the conflicting schedules around this, and we're already seeing that a little bit. Know that even when people can make a best efforts attempt to be on these sessions, not everyone's going to be able to do it, but we'll commit to making sure that everyone stays in the flow. And also, try and reach consensus on the most important areas for the state to focus on from a connectivity standpoint to go to the SPARK committee. Some of the implications for the connectivity panel specifically is, once again, we're starting with a good amount of strategic work that's already done, and we're going to review that today. We're also going to need to work to understand kind of where those priorities stand in the context of other funding sources. The third point is panelists, just to kind of set the stage, have really been selected for their expertise, not to necessarily represent their specific organizations or projects. So everyone kind of keep that in mind. The purpose, aligned to that of this panel is to recommend programmatic direction for the funds, not to advocate for specific projects. Next slide. So in terms of the rules of engagement for the panel, already mentioned time commitment. So definitely appreciate everyone making the commitment to this. Most of the sessions are going to be 2-hour sessions. We think right now there will be 4 of them, but there could be more depending upon where we see things go. There'll also be some homeworks in between these sessions. And if we decide at some point that we want to bring some experts into the process to weigh in on some areas of focus, we may add them, add a session, add them to a session, or maybe have a side webinar if that makes sense. Participation, we want this to be engaging and collaborative. Everyone's here because they have a unique perspective to bring, and you all have expertise, and we need to make sure that we hear that. The one thing, just because of since we're going to be doing this virtual, one request, at least at the start, would be for the panelists to identify themselves by name to the panel each time they speak, just so we can track. And as mentioned before, if there are areas where, something that's an important priority or even a specific project represents a conflict of interest, just flag that. And to the extent there's any voting on it, just abstain from that voting. But once again, we need everyone engaged in general and to be, sharing their thoughts. From a support standpoint, the panelists and we'll give the contact information and even some other resources for panelists at the end. Feel free to ask for and utilize support from Recovery Office, CalRD, and a number of consultants that we're working with to help support the pace of this project. And take advantage of all the avenues for input that exists for this platform. Either during the meetings or in between the meetings. I'll do my best to, while we're talking on this, to try and monitor whether people have questions and are raising their hands. Probably easier for me to do when I'm not the one talking. And then also we're going to have ways to be able to reach out for questions, or you can just as well reach out to the chairs or reach out to me. Next slide. So this next part of the presentation is really more contextual around funding to date, the landscape, and even some initial thoughts from SPARK in terms of where we focus. One thing to keep in mind for all of these advisory panels is that even though this part of the process is kicking off now, there have been activities that have been going on, like listening tours, for instance, and the public proposing ideas that have been happening for a while. We're asking people to go back and to resubmit those ideas in a common submission approach. So each one of the panels can really look at them side by side and make apples to apples comparisons. But throughout that process, the SPARK team, including the SPARK committee, has identified kind of areas of kind of initial interest and focus. And, that's where a decent amount of the work to date around, kind of analytics and pre-reads has been done. Once again, the connectivity panel is a little different because there actually is a full-blown piece of strategy work that was done against that. Next slide. Just to kind of remind people around, what we're talking about in terms of the funds. There have been a lot of funds over the last couple of years that have gone to Kansas and other states to deal with the impacts of COVID. What we're talking about specifically here, the specific focus of Spark, is really the discretionary funds, that $1.6 billion of funds. There's also some other sets of funds, like $1 billion that went locally, not to the state, that may have some synergy with some of the things we're doing here, and vice versa as well. And we need to take that into account. Next slide. But just to be and hone in and be more explicit, this process started, middle of last year. And so some of the funds have already been allocated. So right now, in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of the funds that remain to be allocated, is about $731 million, just so everyone has that clearly in their heads. Now, that could grow over time, if places where funds were allocated before, maybe there ends up being some funds moving back in. But generally, that is kind of what the Spark Committee is looking for, to try and have an integrated view across all the priorities represented by the 4 advisory panels, to make trade-offs around where to invest based on the areas that will have the most important impact for Kansas going forward. During that process, there are going to be some things that are incredibly important priorities that don't get chosen to be addressed through this set of funds. But the hope is that, eventually, by identifying those areas, through other sources of funds and over time, they can be addressed. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Stan to let him start walking through kind of more specifically some of the situation around connectivity and around some of the work that has been done over the last several months.
Right. Thank you, John. Let me just start off with a little bit of perspective around what else is going on in other states. We're certainly in good company in addressing this issue across the nation. And here, what you see is some highlights of what some other states have done with the same fund, just for some notability. Virginia, very forward-leaning at $479 million in their program. Their broadband office essentially is the what you see here, the Virginia Telecom Initiative. And they're focusing, as is Maryland, at $214 million. And Utah on the lower end of the spectrum, as an example. They all have placed a great focus on unserved and underserved, and focused on the infrastructure side of the equation. And the reason we're seeing this, and I think the point would be, these are just a handful of the states that have already moved forward. And it's good that we're in a good position because we're here and moving forward. I think we will fully expect to see many, many, many more states joining the fray, which prompts me to think about supply chain issues, but lest I get too far ahead. So that's a little bit of the landscape in terms of understanding what else is going on. On the next slide, you see here our state and where we've done some work, and this is kind of, where our challenge is. This example here, from a data and analytics standpoint, looks at robust infrastructure, and we'll talk a lot about the robustness of infrastructure. The illustration here shows Kansas ranking 40th when you talk about 500 megabits per second. Now that's a very strong speed that gives you more confidence that all of those needs will be met from a household standpoint and even from a business standpoint. But that highlights the fact that we've got a fair amount of work to do. And let me turn it over now a little bit to talk about how we prioritize, how we should think about prioritizing to Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Stanley. We're looking at this here and we're looking underneath connectivity on this slide. And you see that we're looking at physical infrastructure, their technical support, connectivity, affordability. What do we have people that can afford it? Other things are like, what sectors need the help? Do we need more in telehealth, digital education, precision ag? There's a lot of needs that are coming. So there's a lot of things that can be done out there. This topic here is very narrow, but we need to, as Stanley has told me multiple times, we need to think big. We need to think quick. And we need to be sure that we think smart. This topic is has substantial different funding sources. There's a lot of funding sources out there for broadband right now. We need to make sure we're leveraging all of our dollars that we can and get its best. The good thing is that we do have that strategy already developed and recently released. With that, I'll turn it back.
Sure. On this slide, once again, the point was this panel is going to operate somewhat differently than the other panels because so much work has been done to date in terms of the needs in Kansas, as well as kind of creating a framework for understanding those needs. And as mentioned, we really need to understand as well within each one of those areas, kind of where all the funding sources are, because there's been some great work that's already been done in terms of moving forward against some of those priority areas, tapping some of those funding sources. We are going to, move forward as a group, probably primarily looking at the efforts of this group, as well as the submissions, probably in that type of a framework that Stan's going to walk us through shortly. Next slide. So, ultimately, this is looking at what the output would be, or at least the form of the output that would go to the SPARK committee. And the thought being that, assuming that it stayed within the same framework that you'll see shortly, and I've already seen a little bit of around the strategic work that's already been done to date, identifying within those, what are the key priorities to focus on, and even what's the balance of funding across all of those. And there may be some nuances to it in terms of thinking through, different funding levels or ways of packaging some of these things. There may be some, back and forth discussion with the SPARK Executive Committee as it begins to look at the opportunities here in the context of what's coming from the other three panels as well. But generally, this is kind of the ultimate output that we're looking at. So with that, go to the next slide. So now is when I'm going to hand it over to Stanley to go through kind of the high level parts of the situation assessment for the broadband work that's been done to date, as well as the priority areas that came out of that. Stan?
Okay, thank you, John. So I mentioned the Office of Broadband Development is where I am in the Department of Commerce. A little bit of background. The office was formally established in 2020, and the focus, what you see here, the focus was to ensure all Kansans have the opportunity to live, work, learn, and compete in a global economy. And that was the mission driven in the strategy work that we developed. And want to give a shout out to the other Stanley of the broadband team, Melinda Stanley, who is also working with us on these issues. Next slide. So I wanted to pause here and just really kind of drive home a simple point. I think we all, to varying degrees, understand this is a big issue, and some of the things that we've talked about frequently. But think about this is really critical from a strategic standpoint for the state. We're really trying to be set for success going into the future. We're talking about infrastructure, which means a long-term investment, essentially. And here highlight some topics that, and I just want to pick augmented reality. I have been talking to someone about this space a little bit ago, and the type of applications, all of these examples here, autonomous transportation, the Internet of Things has been bubbling up for a while, but big data and analytics, the type of applications that are going to be coming down the pipe are going to be significant. I would say it's as much as we are used to being able to do this video conference right here two-way, I think it's the order of magnitude and revolutionary impact is going to be along those lines. Artificial intelligence and augmented realities are highfalutin words, but the applications underneath them, the implications on healthcare and education, really means that we've got to go for ubiquitous connectivity. And we're at that point where we can make a big difference on that. The next slide. So with that in mind, again, a little bit of backdrop, what we did coming out, well, what we did as part of the pandemic response, we had a pandemic response program where we did some work in getting some infrastructure projects up and running based on the previous Spark committee and the CARES Act. Coming out of that, obviously we recognized the imperative that we were up against, and we embarked upon developing a concrete strategy, knowing that the very things that we are doing now were on the horizon. So we tried to do a rather disciplined approach, worked with some consultants. We worked on a large amount of stakeholder input, and I was really big on making sure we looked at this from a demand and a supply side. The demand side being the user, the supply side being the service provider community, and related ecosystems for what it takes to make connections happen. And then we looked at what the needs were within those stakeholder communities. And the kind of the output, if you will, for this effort was to come up with what we thought a working framework for initiatives would be going forward to get all Kansans connected. And on the next slide is an illustration of the breadth that we, to show you the breadth of the stakeholders that we did talk to. This list is not complete, so if you don't see somebody on here, that doesn't mean we didn't talk to them. We really focused, and I would draw your attention to the center where we highlight agriculture stakeholders, health and education stakeholders, and the private sector as well. And you see, obviously, the service provider community, we consulted with many of the service providers to get their inputs. And again, the fundamental question we were putting on the table is, what does the state need to do? What's the state need to be doing to make sure we're ready for success, that we are successful and competitive now and in the future? And also, I want to highlight, we took a look through the lens of coordinating amongst agencies as well. Lastly, on this, I think what I would want to point out is just to share with you a little bit of anecdotal experience from developing the strategy and talking to all these different stakeholders. We started out knowing that it was an ambitious task getting all Kansas connected. And as we started to have conversations with some stakeholders, particularly I would note in education and healthcare and agriculture, those three in particular, there was one version or another of we need to think bigger. Because I think everyone perceives this is that moment in time where Kansas can be a leader and really harnessing the power that comes from connectivity. So, you know, I'm encouraged that we had those kinds of input and feedback to develop the strategy that we thought was most holistic, and certainly welcome any feedback and thoughts as we go. But that's a little bit of kind of what went into it. And in the next slide, I would just maybe, hear you just, viewpoints from stakeholders of what I was sharing with you. And let me maybe pause and see if anyone has any thoughts. What are your thoughts on this so far? Anyone? Reactions? And I'll go over a little bit more, but thought I'd pause and see if there were any comments.
Stanley, could you expand on data gaps? Senator Hawk here.
Yes, Senator Hawk, how are you? So the data gaps referred here in terms of being able to understand. So you know about them, everyone, I think you all understand the mapping challenge is a source of data gaps. We don't have a complete map, a map of where broadband is and where it isn't and what type it is and isn't. We have a good picture in some places and not a good place in others. But we also don't have a good set of data on the kind of the layers beneath that drive the economic impact ultimately within the sector. So what our hope is to have some data analytic capability for the state so that we are more effective in targeting resources.
Quick follow-up question. Have we done better at getting a little more granular data about where, if we invest money in infrastructure, where we get the biggest bang for the buck? And is our committee going to have to make some judgments about that, I assume?
Well, that's a good question for the panel to discuss. It's a really difficult question to answer concretely. And there have been analytical efforts done along those lines over at Purdue University for one. I wouldn't say that I've got a sense of a good set of data that I can look at and say, yep, that makes sense the way they looked at it. There's a lot of caveats you have to put on that type of analysis. So I think we just have to, I think the challenge for the panel here is to think about how to prioritize in a way that what we're trying to set the roadmap for is that ubiquitous connectivity that I talked about a couple of slides ago. Because we've been kind of piecemealing and patchworking our way to where we are today, which isn't terrible because most Kansans do have access of some sort. But I think that's what we'll have to kind of work through that as a panel. Next, any other thoughts? I'll go to the next slide.
Hey, Stan, Jeff.
Yeah.
One thought is, I think over the years into the current programs, a lot of the population density has been built, thankfully. We're not certainly ubiquitous coverage, like you said. I think one of the challenges is to get to that, it will be more and more expensive to reach those really remote customers that are unserved or underserved.
Right. Yeah, the reality is kind of the back of the envelope math you need only consult. If there's an area that doesn't have service today, there's a reason it doesn't have service. The service providers have gone everywhere they can go, where they think they can go and make a business case for it. So that's what makes it, unfortunately, that's what makes it expensive, because it's the areas that are still kind of needing to get caught up that we've got to address so that we have a fully functioning and inclusive economy. What I'll do here on the next slide, I just wanted to again kind of size the challenge, kind of how we thought about the challenges that we have, at least going into the strategy development. And we talked about what you see here is the access, and we used it from and let me just point this out for those who may not be completely on it, right? So the definition of broadband is one of the trickier things. So what we said, and then there's the definition of broadband in terms of speeds is often talked about in terms of what's minimally adequate to be considered connected. And that number moves around, and there's a lot of debate as to what it is. And the fundamental of it is, over time, what's minimally adequate or minimally viable, that number is going up in terms of speed, capacity, uploads, and downloads. So what we did here from a strategic standpoint for the state is we said, okay, let's use 100 by 100 megabits per second as the minimum threshold, and understand where that is. What would we need to do in that scenario? And what you see here at that threshold, you can see that's a sizable number of Kansas not at that threshold of 60%. We do have an awful lot of, should point out, we have an awful lot of good news stories here. in parts of Kansas that do have it for sure. And you can guess where the best services are, but it's actually throughout the state. It's a hit and miss is what it really is, but it ends up when you get to that threshold, particularly the symmetrical side of that, it gets to be a lot of Kansas are not having that. And I only highlight that in the sense of what I was talking about earlier in terms of future applications. This upload, for example, speed will be more important. And the service provider community that is on the panel probably can speak to it more effectively than I can, but that's kind of what we looked at from an access standpoint. And then we also wanted to gauge from an affordability standpoint and a device standpoint. And I just will highlight here in the big picture, grand scheme of things, the reason we're looking across all three of these dimensions is because we're thinking about how does the state compete holistically when it comes to connectivity. It's not enough just to have access to the pipe, if you will, to the fiber or to the however you're connected. If you can't afford it or you don't have the digital skills to know how to use it, those factors end up dragging our economy too. So we kind of bake that into our thinking as a comprehensive way of where does that state need to go. Now on the next slide, what we've summarized here, we came away with 4 fundamental pillars or priorities or key initiatives that we wanted to focus on as we produce this strategic planning. Driving robust infrastructure, which I just touched on, and using that 100 by 100 as an initial measure. And then enabling Kansan connectivity. That talks about digital equity and adoption, accelerating transformative applications, and I'll touch on each of these a little bit more in detail. Transformative applications, such as with healthcare and education. And then the last priority here you see here is establishing Kansas as a broadband leader. And that's maybe a little bit of a catch-all, but what it really is us making this a priority for us, not just today, because we just are on the backside of the pandemic, because we're talking about infrastructure. We do need to have the data, we do need to have the capabilities. That needs to be a priority as well. The fact that we have the office is a good first step. On the next slide, I want to walk you through a little bit more of what we went through on this, what the strategy is calling for. And you see here on the left, the same force, those are the 4 priority initiatives that I just reviewed briefly. So here, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, when it comes to driving robust infrastructure, we're talking about the last mile, and in some cases, the middle mile. Ultimately, those 2 things work hand in hand. And again, I will defer to the service provider communities. I'm not the technical or engineering person here, but I know enough to know that they work together in order to get folks connected. And there are a couple of different ways we might be able to approach that. But you see here, funding community-defined projects, placing emphasis on what the needs are, kind of from a community base, from the ground up, rather than from on high saying you need broadband. We're trying to be smart about that and making sure that we're expanding it to the areas that really need it and that will make an impact, a little bit to Senator Hawk's question earlier. There's some opportunity to drive down costs that we wanted to consider that came up in our work. Scalability is a big one that I think is just really critical. We've already started a little bit of work in that area as we with our acceleration grant program, which I'll touch on in a minute. The second one here, again, the effort was to try to at least create the framework for some distinct programs to work comprehensively together to drive that fully connected state. So the enabling connectivity gets at digital equity and adoption. And I touched on these are more illustrative. We created the framework based on best practices and what we've seen in other states and other local communities, in fact, about affordability accelerators, digital literacy academies, and connectivity navigators. That goes to helping enable the infrastructure is what we're really saying here. That part, there's the first one is about the infrastructure. The second one is about enabling people to actually use it and making it more accessible and more equitable across the board. The transformative applications, I mentioned that before, right? So what we are really trying to say here is that we want to be proactive in supporting sectors and scaling up projects that will benefit Kansans and make us, this is again, an opportunity for competitive advantage. And we want to make sure we're bringing some thoughtful strategic planning around that. This is an area that is ripe for opportunity. We've not done a lot of work in this space at all. And I think going forward, as you see here, for example, in telemedicine and precision agriculture, intelligent transportation, this is just the tip of the iceberg over time. Again, this is meant to be a longer term view of what we need to be doing and what we need to be thinking about. And I really summed it up on the last priority indicator here. And that talks about the data, the need for data, to have a place, kind of, I talked about supply side and demand side. Well, the data comes on both sides of those. So there's data understanding where broadband is and isn't, that's the supply side. But we also need to have a way to understand where the demand is. A lot of times, the easy way to think about it is where you would have, and we plan to do this, put a speed test capability where people can self-report what is it that they're experiencing and create a mechanism where we can collect data. And a single data point doesn't tell the story, but over time, as you aggregate data, you're able to draw meaningful conclusions and do a better job of deploying resources against the issues that you identify. And our hope and what the strategy calls for is developing a comprehensive data platform that will drive the awareness and engagement and get us closer to making the most impact out of the investments that we're making. The other point here that I'm a big fan of, and I know you all are as well, is making sure that we've got resources and toolkits available for local communities to be able to work through the other three priority areas is essentially what it is. So, so that we have the resources and there's a go-to place where people know they can find those resources. So that's the strategy overview. And I just wanted to take a minute and give you a sense of where we are, right? So showing us ranked at 40th in really robust infrastructure. We've already, we may be behind, but we do have capabilities and we have already started to make some progress. I mentioned the Connectivity Emergency Response Grant. That was 60-some infrastructure projects across the state that was funded through the CARES Act, the CRF, and that improved. That was our, we deployed a lot of fiber. We had a lot of fixed wireless projects on that, but it was a hurry up offense in the face of the pandemic. And we were able to deploy resources to get some significant numbers up right away. I think we did a good job, particularly under the time constraints. Folks like Jeff and Daniel will probably be able to attest to that better than I can, because they were on the tip of the spear, actually making it happen under very short timing. We also, again, so that's, and we had a $10 million award fund that we used to address digital equity and adoption by another name. We called it the Broadband Partnership Adoption Grant. What it did was, it was a $10 million funding opportunity. We partnered with school districts and with service providers to target low-income households. Again, this was in the throes of the very worst of the pandemic, at the onset of the pandemic, to try to make impact and get folks connected on the short term at a minimum in this case. And then we also have the Broadband Acceleration Grant. This is separate from the pandemic response. This was a program we were teed up to launch prior to the pandemic. It's an $85 million 10-year program for infrastructure projects. Essentially, $5 million a year for the first 3 years, and then $10 million a year for the remaining 7 years. We're in year 2 of that program. In fact, we're taking applications now. So I'll put that plug in. You can visit kansascommerce/ or kansascommerce.gov/broadband to get information about the current application opening. But the point here is funded through the Eisenhower Legacy Transportation Program, the IKE program. And it is also similar to the Connectivity Emergency Response Program. It's designed to get more folks connected. And the last point I wanted to make on this is that, that was a very good learning experience for us particularly with the pandemic response, which was done in a very hurry up offense kind of way. But coming out of that, we got really good feedback from the service provider community, folks like Daniel, folks like Jeff, AT&T. Folks were able to kind of look at our processes and give us feedback so we can make the refinements that we needed to tee up programs for us to address the strategy. So that's kind of, I want to maybe turn it over back over to John for the next part of our discussion.
Thanks, Stanley. Hopefully that was good. Time well spent in terms of just level setting everyone in terms of the situation on the ground and the work that's come out of many months of looking at the broadband situation and strategy. The next part we're going to go into is, okay, now that we understand where things stand and a framework for thinking about how to move forward, how does all this sit within the funding landscape? That would be something that I think Stan's going to spend about 15 minutes on in terms of kind of talking us through how to think about that.
Okay. Thanks, John, for setting that up. So here, I wanted to just paint the picture. The bottom line is there are a lot of different funding mechanisms being brought to bear to improve broadband. And I just highlighted what the state was already initiating before the pandemic. And now you see that from a federal standpoint, significantly increased dollars. So here, kind of the broadband expansion, I just want to make sure everybody is well grounded in kind of what the general lay of the land is. So what we've already funded, the surge, that's to connect the surge, the $50 million went to infrastructure. That was part of our pandemic response. That was the Connectivity Emergency Response Grant Program. Those 66 projects across the state for infrastructure. And then I mentioned the Broadband Acceleration Grant that we were currently in year 2 and taking applications. Those were each $5 million outlays. Well, we did a $5 million, I think it was 12 or 14 projects in year 1. And we are in the process of awarding projects, getting applications and awarding projects for year 2. That's so we've already funded $60 million in total in terms of broadband expansion in recent time. Going forward, and this is worth noting, right? There's several pending funding opportunities that we are actively working. The NTIA is a federal entity. It's in the U.S. Department of Commerce. It's really one of the leading funders of broadband opportunities going forward. There are a lot of different federal agencies involved, but the NTIA is the one that's really been driving the bus, if you will, of late. And they have several programs. I'm only highlighting a few of them here as they relate to what our work is, what work we have. We submitted, the BIP is the Broadband Infrastructure Program that they launched. It was a $300 million funding opportunity. It was highly competitive. That was nationally, that much money going across all 50 states. Obviously, it's not a huge amount. Each state and others were able to apply for that fund. We applied, and we are hopeful. The application is pending. All of the applications are pending. We expect to hear back in the next month or so from the NTIA whether or not we've got any of those projects that we submitted that will be getting funded through that program. The CCPF, that's the Capital Projects Fund. That's another $100 million that we are targeting for, that's coming out of U.S. Treasury Department under their program for infrastructure. And then also, if you all are familiar with you would be familiar with the infrastructure bill that was just passed. That bill, the actual amount is TBD. It's at least $100 million. They have not nailed down the formulation for how the states will be allocated funds, but the states will be allocated funds, and it'll be at least $100 million in that scenario. So if you just kind of do the rough math here, that's $200 million, $217 million. And then the balance is what we've got to turn our attention to, right? So that's kind of where we are, where we've been, what's kind of in the hopper that we know. And now we've got to kind of figure out how do we fund the work that needs to be done. And our task today is looking at the state fiscal recovery fund, but they're also, highlighted here just the additional areas and federal grants that I mentioned. There are a lot of other programs that are being brought to bear, and there are also state-funded initiatives outside of the federal grants. And I think lastly, I wanted to highlight the way we get there is it's going to be a combination of things, is what this really says, right? So the funds that we're discussing as a panel and trying to make recommendations for what investment needs to be made is going to be part of a bigger puzzle, if you will, of how we kind of get all of this focused to drive to our strategic goal of getting all Kansas connected. So that means that there's a role for local governments and not-for-profits, as well as the service providers as well, to come up with innovative ways that we can do this. So matching dollars and co-investing is a big part of how we envision getting to our goal. On the next slide, so as I was mentioning, the state fiscal recovery funding that we're talking about is not going to be by itself a solution to the problem. And this kind of just tries to highlight where the strategy, right? We have a strategy, and then where the funding sources are coming from, where they can come from. So we wanted to highlight that for everybody to kind of get a sense of it, right? So going across, the first items are the ones I just reviewed with you that we have funded or are pending funding. Then you see the CPF, which is the first large allocation that we expect to have, in the infrastructure bill similarly. So, and it goes across, and you can see, I don't want to walk you through the gross detail on this, but what we've done is just kind of tried to start to piece together how these different funding mechanisms can be lined up against our strategic plan. That's really the challenge that we're up against and facing. I think this is an opportunity to continue the momentum that we have coming out of the infrastructure project that we've done and the infrastructure projects that we're actively involved in now. And I think the opportunity is from an efficiency standpoint, and as a panel in the Spark committee, I think this is an opportunity for us to really use this as the launching pad for where we've got to go as a state. With that, let me turn it back over. You guys are probably tired of hearing me talk at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Stanley. Yeah, I'll take it from here. And hopefully that was helpful for everyone in terms of a little bit of level setting. Appreciate it, Stanley. Mentioned earlier that we are going to need to be adaptable because we're not going to be able to predict everything. And we look like we're at least a half an hour ahead of schedule. So what I'm going to suggest is let me get through the next few slides around kind of reviewing, things that are in play, what to expect moving forward, some team logistics pieces. But then, I'd suggest we open it up and start getting people's thoughts, after we get to the end of this, to kind of tee us up for the next session, but just also to get the juices flowing here. So go to the next slide. So this slide really talks about a reminder about the idea submission portal. So as part of this process, and like I said, for the last several months, ideas have been getting submitted just in a variety of different forms and flying at different levels. And so we created, as part of this, a common submission template so that within panels and across panels, ideas could be evaluated side by side in a common manner. And as we move through the process, as ideas that are deemed the highest priority ideas are identified, we can certainly provide, and we'll need to, a lot more detail around those ideas. In some cases, those ideas may look more programmatic. And in some, they may look like a program, but really around a specific project. So we're open to it being either one of those as they develop over time. On the next slide, so, as we move forward, as we think about, how either ideas that have been submitted or ideas that the advisory panel itself comes up with, having gone through the situation assessment and with everyone's, various areas of expertise, thinking about the ideas and laying them against the pillars that Stanley just walked through, as well as thinking about them in light of potential other funding sources as well, so that we make sure, we can evolve things as we go around that. But, as I mentioned before, let's try and kind of build on the shoulders of all the great work that's been done to date. Next slide. One thing as well to note is that for each one of the panels, we're creating a dedicated Microsoft Teams folder. And I believe that if you have this document, if you click on the link, it'll take you to it. But also we'll make sure that everyone gets the link. But it will allow you to be able to see, kind of captured there will be the proposal submissions that we're going to kind of download probably on a weekly basis so that people can see what's coming in. Also resources around onboarding, pre-read materials, other meeting materials, and resources for the advisory panel members and how they can access them in terms of support groups, et cetera, et cetera. So that's going to be coming soon. On the next slide, this is revisiting the 4 meetings that we'd envisioned at this point that we were talking about. So we just really did today a lot more around the strategy review and just kind of level setting people so they could understand the needs, how Kansas is thinking about the areas of focus, as well as, how this all sits in the funding landscape. The next session, which we'll need to schedule and really is meant to be around the mid-February timeframe, is really going to be kind of, rolling up our sleeves and thinking about, priorities and initiatives against those areas. So hear from some broadband stakeholders and experts to the extent that they're identified. And one thing to think about as a homework is if you do feel that there are some experts or stakeholders we should bring into the process, and we can kind of do it in a way that makes sense in this time frame. And once again, they may not fit within any of these meetings. We may be able to kind of create other avenues for that to happen. Also talk about, what are some of the emerging trends that we're seeing in the submissions, and align on the prioritization framework and, how we want to think about scoring ideas. With the thought being that once we're able to kind of establish that, and we may be able to move a little bit farther ahead, even then being able to think about prioritization. So there'd be some brainstorming ideas probably in that second session. The third session is going to be much more around prioritization, with the last session really being around creating that kind of final portfolio. The reason why there's between the third session and the fourth session, why this isn't just, okay, put forward the 10 highest scoring ideas, is the fact that there are going to likely be a lot of synergies between each one of the ideas. And so an idea could be 15th on the list, but it may be an important enabler for the top 3. So, let's step back and really look at this holistically. So in terms of the homework, so our thought was really for the panel members to just continue to review the process overview, the strategy, the pre-read, any other shared materials, become familiar with the programs under those initiatives, and then also kind of gather your own thoughts and inputs from others, other relevant stakeholders around the needs and opportunities here. And once again, potentially identify any experts or expertise that you think would be helpful for this process. And as I mentioned before, So the next meeting would be, we'll get back to you soon in terms of, when we would be targeting for that session. Once again, this same kind of format. The goal would be to really understand the initiatives under the existing broadband strategy and beginning to see what we're hearing from a submission standpoint. And then previewing kind of how we're going to think about filtering and scoring the ideas that we bring forward. And once again, any questions or input, you can reach out to the Spark Task Force, myself, or the chairs. And one last thing that we're going to ask is that everyone complete an exit survey. I think everyone will get the link to this. I'm hoping this is a live link as well. And this is in the interest of, this may be a fast-paced project, but continuous improvement. And so anything where it didn't work, let us know. Anything that worked well, let us know. Anything that could be improved or any suggestions, we want to try and capture that through this exit survey. So with that, that's the end of kind of what we were planning on going through. Like I said, we're about 45 minutes ahead of time here. So, if Stanley and Senator Peterson are good with it, I'd suggest kind of opening the floor up for getting people's thoughts at this point, having seen what they've seen. You, Stanley, Senator Peterson, you good with that?
Absolutely.
Can I ask a question, John, Senator Hawk? When do the submissions go out? And then I noticed you mentioned we might see those at the next meeting. Will we, let's assume we get 15 or 20, less, more, who knows? Would we just see those at the meeting, or are we able to see those as they come in?
What we're going to do, so the submission form's already out, and there's been some press releases around that. It went out to legislatures and agencies, and now you guys are seeing it at the panel level. That form, at least in terms to the public, is going to be open through the middle of February. And there are submissions that are already coming in. We want to be able to kind of take a look at it and maybe kind of clean some of the ones up that come in, but we will add them to the team site probably on a weekly basis and notify them to everyone. So we're not going to save them until the next session. You'll be able to see them beforehand. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I have another question on something Stanley presented, but I'll wait until other people get to ask about process things. Mine's on a funding and universal service fund question.
Sure.
This is Jeff. Hey, Stan, probably a question for you. Underneath the capital projects fund umbrella, Treasury has come out with rules/guidelines, and I'm not sure where you're at on reviewing those or recommendations on what to follow and not follow, because I know a lot of those are guidelines.
Yeah, we generally would be following the guidelines that they put out, just from a practical standpoint. Because when we deviate, we have to explain why we did that. And the rules, from what I've seen, are pretty good. The guidance is pretty good. They seem to, and this is across the board, the funding mechanisms that have been coming out, the guidance, or the pre-guidance, if you will, has been really leaning in on the things that we've talked about today, which is robust infrastructure and raising the bar on this minimally adequate level of service. You all, I forget who it was on the call today, was having trouble. I think it was Representative Smith. Having to be able to only do audio because you've got limited bandwidth is sometimes a component of that. So I think we would be doing that. Jeff, the challenge that I'm feeling pressure about is how to align the different guidelines in different funds. So, that's going to be a little bit of an art that we're pushing to get better answers from our federal partners about, because I think they recognize this is a bit of a challenge, particularly with respect to this fund that we're discussing, and with the infrastructure bill. It's called the BEAD program. I didn't go into the detail on that, but it's the infrastructure bill program is that one that's at least 100 million. That's a BEAD program, and it's got a very, it's a different set of rules, right? Or guidelines, and how to reconcile those in a way that we are still kind of getting everything patched, filling all of the gaps in a consistent way, even though we've got different rules, and we've got to work through how to do that. But that's the thing that I think we've got to focus on at the macro level.
Yeah, this is Molly, and Stan, that was exactly what I was going to hope for. Maybe we could get a little bit more insight, knowing that the restrictions about, or the guidance about where, capital projects fund and BEAD, are directed to, and sort of unauthorized expenses. My understanding is that this fiscal relief funding is probably the most flexible in terms of, the guidance from Treasury. So if we can't do certain things with BEAD or capital projects, how do we look at the opportunity from this bucket of funding to complement what we can do in those other two areas? So I think getting just a little bit more grounding in what is permissible with those, so we know, and not permissible, so we understand the opportunity with this specific bucket of funding would be great.
Yeah, I think that's something we've got to, that's a great point. I don't know that I have all the answers on that, but I think we do have to, the good news is that the guidelines for eligibility for this fund that we're working with. I mean, it generally makes broadband eligible. That's why we're having the conversation. And I think that's probably the bigger issue. And then from there, you all, the service providers know, particularly, from there, we would just create some type of competitive mechanism that comports with the requirements. But I think what I'm saying is we would try to, everything we try to do would be in the context of the strategic framework that we've got, right? That's where I think the opportunity for us to really long-term be more competitive, excuse me. That's where the opportunity is for us to kind of take these different buckets of money and really bring them to bear, so that we don't continue to have the kind of two worlds, connected and not connected.
Hey, Stanley, it's Paul. So on the gaps, on the just trying to find the maps and the data gaps and all of that, are there any other states that are doing this well, or any other entities that are doing this well?
Yeah, it's a wide range. And to be honest, I think there are a handful of states that we think are particularly good, but they're good for different reasons. So I don't want to kind of single out one state as what we would emulate. To be honest with you, the others, we're in good company trying to figure this out is really the way to think about it, because it's a real challenge, right? Everything we've talked about today is applicable to pretty much every state. And we're all scrambling to try to figure out how we can be smart about it. Or at least Kansas is trying to figure out how to be smart about it. I'll speak for us. And I don't know for sure. I mean, that's one of the things we will do, is try to leverage some best practices. Again, there were some states that were doing good work prior to the pandemic, as an example, for infrastructure projects. So it will have to kind of feel our way through it.
Good, thank you.
I've got a question. When we're talking and discussing connectivity and, measuring connectivity, are we just looking at mainly households that have the fast broadband? Or are we looking at coverage maps of, because as a farmer, and where I see the future going is, we need every field theoretically connected in some form or fashion. And so I guess, can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It's not just households. We talk about households because that's the most conventional way to talk about it. But your point is the broader point. We've got to figure out how these transformative applications are going to be leveraged, and make sure we're not overlooking how we might how the funding gets deployed in a way that wouldn't address that, right? Again, I'm not supposing that I've got all the answers. I do think that's the legitimate way to raise it, though. That how do we make sure that this robust infrastructure is everywhere where it's needed?
And right now, you're just mainly talking about wired connections. Is that right?
I think everything is on the table. The wired connections are typically more robust, right? There are technologies that promise more robust, but I'm always going to caution to beware of promises of technology, especially when it comes to infrastructure and long-term opportunities that we're kind of in a once in a lifetime position. So I'm a little biased towards wired, but that's only because of, and that's a little bit more to your point, Brian, maybe that's a little bit more through a residential lens, but it's really through a long-term lens is what it is. And I think when we identify technology that we can invest in that's wireless and sustainable, sign me up.
Well, and Brian makes a good point. One of the things I think that's confusing to a lot of people is wireless versus wired, and mobility versus fixed services, and so I think Brian's speaking more to mobility, which a lot of people refer to as cellular service, and there's certainly a lot of gaps in Kansas and frankly every county in the state related to cellular service still, and there's different programs for that, and I think infrastructure providers would say, without the fundamental infrastructure behind it, you're never going to solve the mobility issue. And mobility has its own challenges related to sustainability and ability to put up a tower, where you live, Brian, and you got to have more revenue than a tractor to support those towers, or you got to subsidize it somehow. And so some of the complexity with this conversation is going to be related to, are we talking about mobility or cellular or fixed internet services that are connecting your farm or your home together? And so the point of making a distinction as the conversation goes and maybe allocating different funding for those different priority needs would be good. Since I stepped in here, I might, Stanley, say a few other things here related to some points we made at the legislature a couple of weeks ago, because it reflects around this conversation pretty well. I think we all understand there's a problem still, and and it's not that people don't want to help fix the problem. It's not that providers and policymakers don't want to fix it. I think there is a level of kind of this loop of doing the same thing over and over, and we really need to step beyond that. One of them, and it was starting to be addressed here, is mapping and data. We've been trying to solve that particular issue for over a decade, and I don't think we're ever going to have a magical map or a magical data set that everybody's going to agree on. We think there's a way to do this, and we've looked at it kind of in a pyramid perspective, where really the data that we have today is somewhere in the middle of the supporting pyramid of data set that we need. But down at the bottom, and what we've seen from the broadband office that's worked extremely well is supportive communities and community confirmation of need. And it's a little subjective, but you certainly have a lot of people, stakeholders, and people that really understand the issue locally and know if there's a problem and know if there's perhaps a bad actor. operating in the area. And when you get the local community to provide support for a project, we find that that's actually a really good way that applications from the state have been supported. And so we would suggest that's a fundamental tenet of how you select where to put funding. And then at the top, one thing we don't talk about a lot, and it can be a little gamed and it can be a little skewed, but Stanley mentioned it's just individual speed test information. While there's certainly things beyond just a provider's service level that affects speed, getting a good set of speed test data in a certain area from users does provide a level of supportive detail to where to put funding. And we know where the problems are, and people are willing to provide that. And so I would encourage us to move a little beyond looking for this perfect map, because I think we'll be here in another year without a solution. And I'll put a plug in for fiber, since that's what we do today. We certainly do fixed wireless too, but fiber has been around for decades, and it continues to scale significantly above that of any other technology, and it has proven technology paths that are factors above any technology that's out there today. And so, Stanley mentioned leaning forward and doing things right. And I think the Spark Committee is mandating us to make, long-term investments that really bring the state forward economically and make us more competitively. Fiber is the solution for that. That's really going to propel this state forward and get it from the bottom, fifth to the top fifth. If we really focus on that, we've had a tendency to invest in lower speed solutions that keeps us down at the lower levels of those, where states are. And I think to get there, we really need to be a little more aggressive in our infrastructure. And when we do that, we're going to grow the Kansas economy, make it stronger and more competitive, and ultimately increase our tax base, which is a great opportunity for the state. So thank you for the opportunity again. Look forward to working with everybody.
Thanks, Dan. One question. Oh, sorry, Senator Hawk, go ahead.
No, you go ahead and I'll go after you if that's okay, please.
Yeah, that's fine. Stan, can you speak to how your office is thinking about the capital projects fund? I know that that's kind of a tight timeline too. I think September of this year is the timeline of when, plans have to be in. So I didn't know if you were able to speak to kind of how you think about it, maybe being a dual track process, or how this process informs that process, but welcome your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting at, with different funding mechanisms, with different rules and guidelines and different timelines as well. So I honestly don't know how the timelines are going to line up. There's just too many variables in play right now. The capital projects fund, yeah, I don't even know if I could say that it's further along than this one is, because it just depends on what Treasury does. But we have, we're managing, we're definitely managing deadlines, and there's something that needs to be submitted for the state to be eligible. We're definitely doing that. But in terms of when dollars will actually become available for investment, I wish I had a better answer than I don't know. I'm not sure is maybe what I'll go with, unless someone else maybe has a better idea of it.
Well, John, my question is, I think, for Stanley, or maybe some other people on our group, and it sort of fits to come after Molly's question. So we have E-rate funding for schools, and we have USF. And that wasn't mentioned as you looked at funding sources. Do you see that as being sort of the local community match or leverage funds that we currently have being used to dovetail with these projects, or will those kinds of programs just continue essentially as they have? And I assume the federal and state funding will remain the same or static as it has in the past. But could you speak to that, how you see those funds interfacing?
Quite an insightful question, Senator, because I didn't touch on all the other pre-pandemic kind of emphasis funding. There were, Connect America Fund, Universal Service Fund, and a litany of other alphabet soup funds that, again, came with different rules and different guidelines and all of the rest of it. What I would say, what I'm seeing and hearing from our federal partners, I can speak to Treasury, FCC, and NTIA particularly, also USDA, because they do a pretty good job of outreach. They're under the gun to figure out how to consolidate and be more efficient in the dollars that they're pushing out so that you could create matching opportunities. Now, typically you wouldn't be able to do a federal match to a federal fund, but I think when it comes to some scenarios, you would, I think, be able to I think we'll be able to structure some of the state dollars, state allocated dollars, to be able to align up with other federal funding. I think I get the sense they're trying to come up with ways to start doing more of that. It's just too soon to say how much that's going to become reality. Just not sure.
Good. I want to keep doing the good things we've been doing and not lose sight of that. But I also want to be smart with those dollars if we can leverage them. So thank you.
This is Jeff. One other thought that kind of ties into that, I think, is the grant percentage, because, the acceleration grant is 50%, which allows those dollars to go further. But as we get more in rural situations with less population, a 50-50 grant match becomes harder to make work. Because in all of these situations, of course, those funds are going to build the network, but there's no funds for ongoing upkeep, maintenance, support. That has to be done off of a business model from that viewpoint. So, with the SERG, that was an 80-20, which did, in our case, allow us to go to a much more, remote area with less customers, because it was an 80-20 and not a lot of discussion here. I think that's just one of the things that kind of ties into the match question and something the panel will need to discuss down the road. You want the dollars to go as far as possible, but yet you also have to make some of those projects feasible.
Yeah, I agree, Jeff. I definitely think that's, right for a panel discussion, because I don't have a crystal ball or a magic wand to know all of these things. I can tell you, you're absolutely right. 50% threshold in our one program, the acceleration grant. That's a high threshold for where we're trying to make impact. Because the problem in these hard to serve or high cost to serve areas is there's lack of funding. So there are definitely going to be cases where we need to be mindful of how we structure the match, is maybe the way to put it.
Dan, I know that the FCC is obviously working on its updated maps. How do you envision what the state's going to do in terms of data collection to kind of complement what's happening at the federal level?
Well,
data.
Right. A little bit of that is just, it's relevant for what we're trying to do here in terms of targeting and again, maybe just to kind of give everybody a sense of a little bit of the dynamics in data. First of all, the mapping has been a chronic problem, right? Over decades, or definitely the last decade. Problematic to determine where, how to get an accurate map. Daniel mentioned it as well. So the FCC has been tasked with coming up with a solution for that. And we hope that they do. The state's role is to try to we're trying to not be in competition with the feds and to see who can come up with an accurate map first. I don't think that gets enough Kansans connected. Is why I've not really been a big fan of that. In fact, most of you guys know that. So I think what I'm a fan of conceptually, because I think it helps when you take these dollars of investment, whatever we may get out of this fund, to go towards infrastructure, is to really configure our efforts where we have a good visibility on the supply and the demand. That's kind of my bias, is to match up the supply data with the demand data, because I think, again, from an analytical standpoint, it'll, over time, it will allow you to zero in on things that you may not otherwise catch. You know, and it may not even be through anybody's fault, but I think that's really the way, you know, so that Brian can say, you know, I submitted a bunch of data points, and at some point, and some others did the same thing, and we're looking at that data platform I talked about, and able to just go, okay, you know what, over here in this county, it looks like it's served because of ABC, and it's not served based on data from XYZ. Not, and then we can have the discussion with the relevant stakeholders to go, okay, so what is the solution to that? And is it something where taxpayer dollars need to go? I don't think that's, for where we are today and this funding level where we're at, there are so many projects that are clearly meeting the threshold for demonstrated need that that's why it's not at the top of my list. But it is on the list, Molly, to your point. John, that's kind of some thoughts from the broadband office. Mr. Chairman, did you have any thoughts you want to add in?
No, I did not, but I was just wanted to remind people when we get ready to speak to please. Just a quick reminder. Thank you.
Great. I'd say, oh, you wanted to go ahead?
No, I didn't hear what Senator Peterson said.
I think he was mentioning raise your hand if you want to speak. The one thing I will say is that may be one thing that I might adapt, because I think it's actually worked fine without people raising their hands. So
I think you were saying is say who you are too.
Say you are, yeah.
Yeah.
Say who you are was what I was pointing at. This conversation's went real well today. I'm really pleased, and I've actually learned a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say from my standpoint, once again, this just went to show that, you know, everyone's super engaged in this really important topic, and you know, being able to have the time for the discussion at the end here was great, right? Maybe a little less tell, a little more discuss, and certainly as we go through this process, it's going to be more like that going forward. So unless anyone else has something that they would want to go through, I'd suggest actually giving back everyone a little bit of their time, and appreciate everyone taking the time. Before I do that, anyone have any last comments that they'd want to share?
I was just going to mention one thing that wasn't talked about today, and I'm not an expert on it, and so I just, maybe people could think about it and bring back some thoughts. And we didn't talk about adoptability or the challenges related to service issues in urban areas, and you know, it would be good to hear what those issues are.
Great. Awesome. Appreciate that. Well, with that, I am going to suggest that we end the session, and hopefully everyone has the info that they need, complete the exit survey. And you should all have or be getting a link to the team site. And we'll be working to schedule the next session, and be thinking about the submission form, and you know, relooking at the pre-reads and any expertise that you think should be brought into the subsequent sessions. Great.